All right. Well, welcome everyone for joining us today. My name is Alyssa Vinson. I am the residential horticulture agent at the Manatee County Extension Office. Our office is located in Palmetto, Florida. And I'm going to be talking to you today, as well as my colleague Armando Ubeda. Armando, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm happy to do so, and welcome everybody. I see that we had a lot of people from all over the place. I'm Armando Ueda. I'm the Florida Sea Grant agent based in Sarasota County, and yes, I'm going to be part of this 100% with Alyssa, and I'm excited about it. So that's it.
Awesome. Great. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started just with a quick introduction. For those folks who are maybe new to the world of extension, I just quickly like to give a brief overview of what is extension. We are part of the University of Florida, the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. We are one of Florida's 2 land-grant universities, and as such, we work cooperatively with our local county government to offer research-based education and solutions for everyone's lives. And I particularly work in the realm of horticulture. My background is in ecology and ecological restoration. So I really come to horticulture from the perspective of trying to encourage folks to have a little bit more of an understanding of how the impacts that they make in their landscapes impact the broader environment. And so you might be asking yourself, well, what is this person who teaches horticulture talking about mushrooms for? And you might be even more confused to hear that Armando is a sea grant agent and wondering, well, what's he teaching mushrooms for? And we actually just kind of have a natural curiosity and love of Florida fungi, and came together a couple of years ago now, realizing that there was kind of a lack of educational programs offered by Extension, and we want to talk to you about fungi and get you to love them as well. And so what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about what mushrooms are, an introduction to the diversity of fungi, what are the main parts, distinguishing characteristics, some growth habits and habitats where we find them, and then some basic identification methods. And so to get us all started off, I want to know what you know. So type in the chat box, if you would, please, the letter for which picture represents a mushroom. So which of these 3 pictures is a mushroom? You're going to see this again a little bit later. So don't be surprised when you see these same photos again. All right. So what is a mushroom? And you may hear me as I go throughout the presentation use the term mushroom and fungi kind of as synonyms for each other, but they do represent 2 kind of different aspects of the organism, right? A mushroom is the fruiting body of a fungus. It's only one part of a larger organism, and it helps to facilitate fungi reproduction, right? So you can almost think of it as analogous to an apple or a fruit, right? It is a means by which the fungus is going to distribute its reproductive information throughout the broader community. Some vocabulary terms to familiarize yourself with, and I'm not going to read through all of them, but you'll hear me say things like fungi, right? It's a kingdom of eukaryotic life. We'll talk about spores, which are the units of sexual or asexual reproduction that mushrooms use. Mycelium is the network of interconnected hyphae. And a hyphae is a specialized individual component of mycelium. So it's sort of like you have a spider web and then you have one strand of that spider web. So hyphae would be that single strand, mycelium would be that whole web. And then if you're not familiar with the terms mesic and xeric, that refers to the amount of moisture present in an environment. So mesic is going to be fairly wet, xeric is going to be dry. Phytoremediation is rehabilitation of soils or water by plants or fungi. And then symbiotic or symbiosis is when 2 different or more than that organisms live in close proximity to mutual benefit. All right, so just some kind of things to keep in mind as we go throughout. So what do mushrooms do? They are ubiquitous. We find them throughout the planet in almost every environment, terrestrial, aquatic, marine. They are really responsible for pivotal nutrient cycling. They are instrumental in making dead and decomposing matter, getting it broken down and getting those kind of constituent nutrients available to the other living things in that community. They also form symbiotic relationships with over 90% of all terrestrial plant species. When the first algae kind of tumbled up on the seashore and needed a way to stick to the land surface, they developed a relationship with fungi, and those algae and those fungi stuck together and formed lichens, which still are present today. We'll talk a little bit more about lichens, but that relationship that sort of evolved right at that moment has carried forward throughout almost all terrestrial plant species. And so these fungi live either inside or on the outsides of roots, and they help the plants actually absorb more nutrition by increasing the surface area of those roots. They exchange minerals and nutrients with the plants for the sugars that the plants produce through photosynthesis. They can act to remediate polluted soils. Mushrooms are really good at pulling things out of the soil and out of the water that we don't want. There are actually oyster mushroom species that can be trained to eat cigarette butts and petroleum. And so we can use what we know about fungi to our advantage to help us remediate polluted environments. They act as a food source for mammals, insects, gastropods, us. I love to eat mushrooms, and they provide essential amino acids and minerals. And we'll talk more about that in another section of the presentation. You may or may not have heard of the Wood Wide Web. And the Wood Wide Web is just this concept that relies on that understanding of what we call the mycelial network, right? So each tree or plant in an environment has some amount of mycorrhizal fungi living on or inside of the roots, right? And as that mycelium travels through the soil, it interconnects the root systems of other tree and plant species together through the mycelium. And there's evidence that there are some shared resources that get transported through the mycelial network. And there's even the possibility that there are some plants that kind of take advantage of that mycelial network and use it in kind of a saprophytic manner, where they actually kind of tap into that mycelial network and steal nutrition out of it from other plants. So it's a really fascinating concept where we can see that one forest or one landscape really doesn't exist in a singular manner, right? We can't look at one tree or one plant as a singular organism separate from the others. They really are a community. Now, to describe fungi, they are a very diverse group of organisms. They are, for a long time, they were considered plants, but they have since been kind of pulled out of the plant kingdom in recognition of the fact that they're actually closer to us genetically than they are to most plants. So we have some main phyla associated with the fungi kingdom. The Chytridomycota are mainly aquatic, very primitive. Some of them are pathogenic. You may have heard of the amphibian chytrid fungus that harms frogs and other amphibians. These are going to be microscopic. You're not going to really see these Chytridomycota. Zygomycota are mainly terrestrial. Some of them are mycorrhizal, meaning they live in that symbiotic relationship with plants. They're very resistant to freezing and drying. And there is one species of the Zygomycota, the Aphyllophorales mushroom, that's actually one of the fastest living organisms on the planet, because as it gets ready to reproduce, has one little spore stored on top of its little tiny fruiting body, and it swells up with water, and when it bursts, it shoots that spore off, and hopefully it lands on a nearby cow patty. And so those Aphyllophorales mushrooms are really fascinating. But again, they're very, very small, difficult to see with the naked eye, as are a lot of the zygomycotes. Ascomycotes can be in marine environments, freshwater environments, or terrestrial environments. About half of them form lichens. The fruiting body of these is called an ascocarp, and some really famous ascomycotes are truffles and morels. So you think about that shape of a truffle, it's just kind of like a nodule that you find underground, or a morel that has this kind of honeycomb-like structure on top of the mushroom, and that's that ascocarp where the spores are held. We also have the basidiomycotes. Now, the basidiomycotes are where you're going to find most of kind of the mushrooms that you would think of when you think of a mushroom. So these are your boletes, your agaricales, right? Turkey tails, stinkhorns, many culinary mushrooms exist within that basidiomycote phyla. So they are detritivores, right? They're going to break down dead and decaying matter. Some of them are mycorrhizal, and there are some, the rusts and smuts, which are parasitic. I have heard that corn smut is delicious, and I have yet to eat it, but I look forward to the opportunity to do so. And then again, just remember that lichens are like fungi in that they have a component that is a fungus, but they are a symbiotic relationship between a fungus, an algae, sometimes a fungus and a bacteria, sometimes all three are in a symbiotic relationship together. And that fungus provides the structure where the algae can kind of stick to the surface, and the fungi can decompose and break down kind of the mineral material that they're existing on. And then the algae photosynthesizes and provides sugars for the relationship. There are several orders within the phyla, some of the most common ones, and some of the ones that are most easily recognizable are the agaricales, the boletales, rusolales, cantharellales, and the Aphyllophorales. And so really fun to say, but what does that mean? These are the amanitas. So think about the red and white capped mushroom that we all are familiar with from Alice in Wonderland, right? Amanita, boletus, the bolete mushrooms. We'll take a look at their sporangia in another couple slides. The rusolales are very common here in Florida. You probably have all seen a rusula. Lactarius are also very common in that order. And then the chanterelles. I know I love to eat chanterelles. I hope you all like to eat chanterelles. They are delicious. And we have, I believe we have 7 different species of chanterelles here in Florida. And then the Aphyllophorales are the pleurotus, all the oyster mushrooms, all the varieties of oyster mushrooms that we can find. Those are the pleurotus. And so those fall into that Aphyllophorales. So what makes up a fungi, right? Well, we talked about mycelium, that network, that webbing. You have those individual strands that are called hyphae, and some of those hyphae develop specialized functions. The mycorrhizal hyphae will actually grow into or around those plant roots and facilitate the exchange of nutrients and sugars. You even have some hyphae that can consume nematodes. And so these are really interesting hyphae. They form almost like little donuts in the soil, and then the nematodes kind of squirm in between those donuts, and they swell up and catch the nematode, and then the hyphae actually grows into the nematode and consumes it. When we see a mushroom, like you see in the pictures here, the mushroom is actually a collection of specialized hyphae that have all gotten together to form the shape of the mushroom. The mushroom is the reproductive structure. It's spore bearing, and it's going to differ in shape, size, color, texture per species. Pretty much, if you can imagine it, a mushroom can look it. There are even bioluminescent mushrooms and mushrooms that are neon green and yellow and blue. They take some pretty fantastical shapes as well. So as we mentioned, there are different reproductive strategies. The Chytridomycota that you see in the bottom right-hand corner, again, these are microscopic. They actually have motile spores with flagella. The zygomycotes that you see in the bottom left-hand corner, those are the pilobolus. So those are the ones that are going to have their little spore, wear it like a little hat, and then they're going to fill up with water pressure and ping, they're going to shoot that spore off into the air and hopefully onto a nearby piece of poop because that's where they like to live. The ascomycota in the top left there is the morel. Again, the spores are stored in the asci. There's 8 ascospores in each, which is the ascocarp on the ascocarp, which is that whole structure there. So that's that waffle-like, brain-like looking structure on top of that mushroom. And then the basidiomycotes, the spores are on what's called the basidiocarp. So it's either gills, like we're very familiar with, or sporangia, like you'll see on a bolete. Here you can see a diagram that kind of shows you some of those identifying characteristics of mushrooms. We have the stalk. Sometimes we have what's called the ring. When mushrooms are in this button stage, they have this universal veil around them. And then as they grow, that universal veil may or may not stick around. You can see that this one has some patches, warts, gills. Here we have a bolete, and this bolete is showing you that it has the sporangia surface, and it's actually like little tiny tubes in there, and the spores will just fall right down out of the tubes. We call this part of the mushroom, the top of the mushroom, the cap, and the edges of the cap are called the margin. And so if you're familiar with kind of plants and morphology for plants, you'll know that the edge of a leaf is also called the margin. And so we have all kinds of words to describe the shapes and textures of the cap, of the margin of the cap, of the stalk, whether or not the universal veil is present, and all of those different characteristics. Here are some photos that kind of show these things in real life. So you can see the pores here on this this bolete. They're like little open holes there. They're little tubes, and those spores kind of fall out of those tubes. Here we can see some very clearly identifiable gills. They're almost like little curtains on the underside of the cap. Sometimes there are teeth. Sometimes the underside of the mushroom cap is smooth. Sometimes it's like a brain-like structure, coral-like structure. But this is just, again, the spores are going to be held within these structures. And then as the mushroom matures, the spores will drop out of that and either will be wind-borne or water-borne to get to a new location so that they can reproduce. Here you can see closer up picture of the ring or skirt, the gills. This is a transverse photo of a mushroom. So it's been cut in half. You can see that this actually has a bit of a hollow stalk towards the bottom. This is a basidiomycote, and you can see the shape of the cap there. Now, sometimes the shape of the mushroom and the color of it and its location is not enough for us to know what it is. So we actually have to look more closely at the spores of the mushroom. And what you're seeing on the right-hand side of this slide is what's called a spore print. You actually take the cap of the mushroom and you set it gill side down on a sheet of paper. You can cover it with a bowl or something like that and leave it overnight. And then you take the bowl off and you lift the cap of the mushroom up, and you should see those spores have dropped down out of the gills onto the paper. You can tell a lot about a mushroom based on the color of its spores. Sometimes that's not enough though, and you have to do some microscopy and look at those spores under a microscope. And you can see the blown up image of these spores here on top of that spore print. Sometimes we have some other structures. We have different types of stalks. Here you can see a very prominent vulva or cup at the base of the stalk on this mushroom, the veil on the stinkhorn mushroom. And then over here, you can actually see what the mycelium looks like all together. And I'm sure a lot of you have picked up your mulch or overturned a log and seen something very similar to this. Here again are just some additional words to help with identifying mushrooms based on some of those characteristics. So remember, we talked about the margin of the cap is the edge of the cap. You can have an enrolled margin. You can have a striate margin. You can see this guy looks like he has a little pointy hat on, and this is an umbo when you have that little point right there in the middle of the cap. Pleurotoid means the pleurotus mushrooms, the oyster mushrooms, they kind of have this off-center stalk here. And then my absolute favorite one is this word here in the middle. These ink cap mushrooms have a characteristic that's called deliquescence, which basically just means that they melt. And so you can see you go from this to this, and they're pretty fascinating mushrooms. So not just shape, color, margin type, stalk type, presence of a ring, cup, vulva, any of those things, those are all important, but you also have to think about the growth habit of your mushrooms when you see them, if you're trying to identify them. So where do you find them? Are they on compost or soil? Is it sandy? Is it clayey? Is there a lot of leaf litter there? If it is in a lot of leaf litter, what kind? Are we talking about oak leaves? Are we talking about maple leaves? Is it in pine straw? Is it on a living tree? What kind of tree? A hardwood, a softwood? What on the same for a dead tree? Is it, hardwood, softwood, palm? Is it growing in manure? Because there are mushrooms that are specific just to manure. What about the growth habit as well? So we have different shapes that mushrooms take. So they can be conchs, which are kind of like an ear stuck to the side of a tree. Puffballs, you can see in the top right here, this is an earth star mushroom. It is related to puffballs. When you squeeze it, it goes, and the spores come out of that little hole in the top. You can have shelf fungi like you see up here on this log. And then you can have on the bottom too, I wanted to put these two pictures side by side because when you first look at these mushrooms, they're both orange. They both have gills that kind of come down the stalk a little bit. They have that upturned cap. If you weren't paying a lot of attention, you might say that these could very well be the same mushroom. But if you notice in the picture on the left-hand side, that mushroom is alone. It's growing singly. And the mushroom on the right is actually growing in a cluster. And so the difference there is between a known edible mushroom, a chanterelle, and a known poisonous mushroom, a jack-o'-lantern. So that clustered growth is really an indicator there. They're also size difference, but you can't tell that in this photo. Here's some common Florida fungi. Remember, we talked about Russalales in the top left corner there, earth stars, Ganoderma. Ganoderma is very common. This is a Ganoderma growing on oak. It does also grow on other types of trees, namely palms. It's a real big problem for palms. Different kinds of stinkhorns of all types. Here in the bottom middle is an armillaria mushroom, a honey mushroom. And so these are pretty common. I get questions about these a lot in our extension office from folks who find them in their backyard. When you're, considering identifying mushrooms, think about their habitat that you find them in. And Armando will talk a lot more about kind of specifics in a minute. But, the habitat where it's growing is also very important. We do find mushrooms again all throughout Florida, though, everywhere. And we find, fungi in freshwater, in marine environments, all the way up to the symbiotic lichens that live in the Arctic tundra. I get this question a lot from individuals who either bring a mushroom into our office for identification or send in a photo. Can I eat it? Right? And the short answer is no. No, please don't. The long answer is maybe, but you have to contact local experts and definitely don't eat anything wild foraged. Now, I do teach some classes on gardening with mushrooms where we look at growing things like oysters and lion's mane and shiitakes at home. And those, you're getting your spawn from a reputable source and you're growing it in a clean environment in your home. So those are the kinds of things that we recommend that you work on if you want to eat mushrooms that you grow. Wild foraged mushrooms can have a lot of concerns in addition to just identification. If you're not familiar with the area in which they're grown, it's possible that those mushrooms have been taking up and bioaccumulating contaminants from the soil. And so you wouldn't want to consume a mushroom in an area you're not familiar with. Obviously, it could have lead or arsenic. In particular, in parts of Florida where there was historic cattle, they used to use arsenic dip pits a long time ago. And so there's some remnant arsenic in some areas. And so you'd want to definitely be aware of that. So again, no, please don't eat the bolete growing in your backyard. But there are experts that you might be able to reach out to and find some locally sourced mushrooms. If you ever run into a situation where a pet or a child has eaten a mushroom in the yard, the Poison Control Center will contact actually our UF fungal expert, and he can provide information. But something to remember with that is always keep some of the mushroom so that we can have it for correct identification, or so that they can have it for correct identification. All right, now I'm going to ask you this again. You all saw this slide at the beginning. If you would go ahead, please, and just type in the chat box one more time, which of these is a mushroom? A, B, or C? Most people are now correct. Yes, the one on the left is a mushroom. That is an earth star mushroom. It's related to puffballs. The one in the middle is a slime mold, which are actually amoebas. They are not, they're not fungi. And then the right-hand picture is of a moss, which is a plant. I see a couple questions. One question that I'll just go ahead and answer right now is, are puffballs edible in Florida, or is that too broad a question? Yes, there are edible puffball species in Florida, but again, refrain from eating anything wild forage due to potential bioaccumulation. Okay, and then the other question, I think I will answer directly to that individual. Okay, and with that, I am going to go ahead and I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to pull up Armando's portion of our presentation.
And while you do that, Alyssa, that was a great presentation, by the way. And I have eaten the corn snot, and it's delicious. So you talked about it, and it is, yeah, one of the best mushrooms I've eaten.
Great. Well, I will definitely look for
I
it.
like the Spanish word for it better, though. It's huitlacoche. I mean, it's pronounced it, but it's
that does sound better.
Again, welcome back. Well, not welcome back. We're gonna start, but I'm excited about this, as you can tell. And I didn't introduce myself fully, but as Alyssa said, I'm not a mycologist by any means. I'm a mycophile, so I love mushrooms. I love fungi. And my background is actually marine biology. So I'm a Florida Sea Grant agent, which is the Marine and Coastal Extension agent in Sarasota County. But I'm familiar with some of these species, and as Alyssa said, we really find that there was a gap in knowledge and education programs around fungi. So we decided to do this, and it's been, well attended. So I'm glad to have you here, and more people are coming in. With that, I'm going to start. So I'll be covering the identification of mushrooms. And just as a disclaimer, like Alyssa said, right, don't just go and eat whatever, because I like to make a joke that everything is edible at least once, but it's not true. So you have to be really careful about this, and that's why we put up these presentations. So next. So this part of my presentation, I'm going to go a little bit about the importance of knowing how to identify mushrooms. Alyssa already addressed some of them, right? Of course, like to prevent your pet maybe getting sick or something like that, knowing what maybe is attacking your plants, or finding out if you have really good fungi in your yard that is benefiting your yard. So there's many reasons. We'll cover some of those, right? Some things to consider to make this a safe way to identify mushrooms. Some tools that you might use, that's mainly based on my own experience. So if you have others, please add them to it. Some of the parts we'll review. You will see some of the same slides that Alyssa presented. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because she did great talking about the parts of the mushroom, but we'll go over them because we have to in terms of talking about the identification. And then some advice if you want to go ahead and try to start learning about identifying mushrooms. So remember, what is a mushroom, right? When we talked about mushroom, we're talking about the fruiting body of a fungi. So that's something that you see and you might not see again for a while. So that's something good to consider. It's only part of the organism, so you don't see the mycelium. Sometimes you see it. So this is just a tiny fraction of the whole specimen that you might have around your environment. And they are mainly, they are to facilitate reproduction. So that's like a fruit will be in a tree. That's the main purpose of the mushroom itself. So some of the benefits associated with this mushrooms, we'll talk more about this later, but just to give you a general kind of thing. Alisa already alluded to some of these, right? But they are natural recyclers of our natural environment, right? They communicate. Also, they help communicate between trees. The food source for many different things. We'll be using technology now, replacing some of the materials, synthetic materials that we'll be using, like plastic. Now looking into using fungi as a way to replace plastic. So there's multiple uses, right? And one of them, obviously, is the edibility of some of these mushrooms. So you find them at supermarkets, you find them in multiple cuisines through the world. So the benefits are very broad, and we're still only reaching the surface of some of these benefits that these organisms provide to us or could provide to us. Next, please. There's a lot of misconceptions regarding mushrooms, especially like you can see in this drawing, which I really like. But there's a lot of misconception that all mushrooms are poisonous, or the majority of them are, which is not true. You will see that in the third portion of our presentation about some facts or some numbers about statistics about how many mushrooms actually can kill you. But there are not a lot of them. So there's a lot of unknown, and part of this misconception is because of ignorance, right? There's a lot of people don't know about. Sometimes you even taught as a kid not to even touch mushroom because it might be dangerous. So that is how to put up a lot of fears in people's. But there's also reasons why these fears exist. If you don't know about Buddha, but Buddha actually, the Buddha, he was actually supposedly, he died after eating some wild mushrooms that was fed. So somebody misidentified a mushroom and given something that supposed to be safe. And that's, well, he in the literature said that he died peacefully, but yeah, it was an accident. So you can tell why the fear is there, right? There's more cases of that. But in reality, it's all about knowing what you are eating or manipulating, right? So there's ways to prevent this. So there's a lot of misconception. It's mainly because of ignorance and lack of education. Next, please. So just to show you the diversity of these organisms, right? There's, as you can see from this article right there, might be from 2.2 million to 3.8 million species. I know 3.3 million, no, just kidding, not even close to that. So there's a lot of species that if you want to learn them all, good luck. But, and there's complication to this too. The mushrooms are the fruiting body of this organism, right? So you don't see this full tree like a mango tree. You might not have mango, but you'll see the tree in your yard or nearby through the whole year until it produces the fruit, right? Mushrooms are not the same. So a little challenging. There's a lot of them. And there are some species that, like we address here, are poisonous. So, but even then, there's hope. And that's why we're here, because you can go one mushroom at a time and learn at least some of the most common mushrooms that we'll have here in our state or in other places where you live. Next, please. So can you learn to identify mushrooms? Yes, you can. Next, please. And again, just a disclaimer, right? You always want to do this, not to eat them, unless you're studying them for years and you're an expert or you have checked with an expert, but don't do that. This is just for you to learn to identify them. Like Alyssa said too, some of them might be growing in places that they might be, carrying some pollutants with them that you don't want to ingest as well. So this is just for you to learn to identify mushroom, which is a fun thing to do, and also to help you understand the ecology of your landscape and the area where you live in. Next, please. So what do you need for becoming, or at least good identifying mushrooms? At least this is my recipe that I think is the good things that I might call it microfiles you have if you're going to start learning how to identify them. You have time. You have to have time and patience. Time because it will require some time to learn, right? It's a lot to learn. And the more time you spend, the more familiar you'll become, like anything else. Patient because it's seasonal. So at least in our area, when the rainy season comes, that's when we get the mushrooms, the fruiting bodies, right, popping everywhere. So that's when you will go and try to identify the mushrooms most likely, because you have more abundance and diversity of different species in your area. But that's a good thing too, because it gives you time to prepare, right? It gives you time either to forget what you learned last season or to keep learning and become more knowledgeable about fungi. You have to have a good place to go, right? Identify a good area. The mushrooms, you see mushrooms, that's a good thing to come back to the same area so you can see things changes in seasons and kind of understand better the whole picture instead of going from one place to another place. Stick with a few places at first. You have to have some tools. I will go in some tools. You have to be a little methodical. You don't have to be, super detail oriented, but you want to have some methodologies in place because it will help you, and we'll see why. A little bit stubborn, right? Don't give up. You have to be curious about, because obviously if there's no curiosity, it will be hard for you to start looking at difference. So be observant, look closely, and be a little humble. It might be challenging sometimes, but you get there. And learn, willingness to learn about mushrooms and the ecology, not just about the fruiting body, but also what are the requirements for that fungi. Where do they live? Are they associated with some trees? Are they like open areas? Are they like, when do they pop up? Things like that will also help you as well. And next place is going to be 2 animations here. And you need a family that actually put up with you. This is a picture actually of my family. This happens to me a lot, that some members of my family continue walking. Some of them kind of concerned that I'm not staying behind, that I'm staying behind, taking pictures of looking at a mushroom, and then next place. And then finally, kind of everybody gave up on you. So what do you need to identify mushrooms? 3 easy steps, and this is kind of common sense, and we'll go over them in a second, but you have to collect your mushrooms in order to identify them. That's one thing. Like I put at the very beginning of my presentation, like a little phrase that says 1 mushroom at a time. I try not to go and pick up everything that I can pick up. I stick with a few things so I can really dedicate my time to those specimens, and I will talk more about that. Step number 2 is make good observations, right? Record your data, and we'll show you some tools that you could use. And we actually have a journal, identification mushroom journal, that might not be the proper name, but at least I'm sure it's going to talk more about that. That will help you as well to keep up track of all your data and of your records. And you might have to do some micro identification, so looking at the spores on the microscope. And third is the final step, obviously, is to identify your specimen, which is, right, very fulfilling and happy feeling after all the hard work. So what do you need to collect mushrooms, or at least to identify them and collect them, identify them? This is in my personal list of things. You can add a couple more, but this is on mine. So you need a knife. There's actually knives that you can actually buy. There's kind of shape to actually cut mushrooms. And some of them actually came with a little brush to clean up some of the dirt from the gills or other parts of the mushroom, the cap or anything like that. So there's a lot of varieties, but a pocket knife will do. A wax paper bag or brown paper sandwich bags is a good way to separate the different species, or the different species you might think you might have. And no plastic, because plastic tend to accumulate water. So it's, and then, right, humidity, especially in our area, then it can affect the mushroom and make it look weird, or can make the mushroom do things that you don't want to, that will not help with the identification. So more like one of those paper bags, wax paper bags, keep them kind of intact better. A basket is a good practice to have, and that's most people have nowadays. You don't want anything that will compress and put in a backpack. Sometimes you move in the backpack, you deteriorate, you impact the mushroom, and they will be hard for identification. A Sharpie, pen, or pencil, obviously, to take notes and to write your comments. I like to have a Sharpie too, because I write in the wax paper some comments so I can know which bag is which, and just to follow, and again, to be more organized. A notebook, obviously, to take notes. Sometimes you might need an insect repellent, especially if there's an area there's ticks and things like that. Some ticks can carry bad diseases, so you want to be protected. It's not just about how tough you think you are, but it's also to protect yourself. So it's a good practice to have some repellent. Binoculars, believe it or not, there's some mushrooms that you might see from afar that you might not have easy access, and you might want to look at them. Because you don't have access, or maybe you don't want to walk through 2 creeks to go look at something, when you can look at them from afar and basically identify it. So once you become familiar, a pair of binoculars will be very handy as well. A phone with a camera on, which pretty much everybody has, especially nowadays. Those cameras are becoming very good at taking even closer pictures. So that's a good practice to have cameras, something you can refer to, like the photos I'm using in this PowerPoint are mine. I've taken either with my phone, most of them. So you will see, you can do a good job with them as well. Obviously, water, hat, etc., etc. Next, please. I make a joke that's the main reason I'm still having kids. And again, that's a joke, because children are really good to go. Mushrooms identification. They're the right level to see a bunch of stuff on the floor. They're very curious. Sometimes they're very patient as well. And so if you have family members, especially children and your family or friends, yeah, invite them because they, also it's good because it teaches the future generations. But anyway, so you can add to the list on your own, but this is my things in my list. Next, please. All right, things to consider, right? I like this phrases too. Keep your eyes on the stars, but feet on the ground. By Roosevelt, this means that have high goals, but be humble. Start little by little. I will defer to using the little brown mushrooms, right? Try to identify every little brown mushroom that is out there. Will be really hard, and that's why people call them little brown mushrooms, because a lot of people don't want to identify them. There's so many things, so many of them, that it's really hard. They all look alike. So try maybe with those that have actually very unique characteristics. For example, here we have and I'm going to talk more about this bolete right here, the old man of the woods. You have all the scales, you have this coloration, so it's a little easier. Some of them actually, like this one in particular, it will bleed after you cut it. It will change coloration, so it's a little bit easier to identify. And another thing is, it's important to learn kind of the life cycle of the fungi in general. So now, because a mushroom might look kind of have a shape when it has 3 days old, but it might look totally different when 1 day is old. And again, it depends on the life history of that particular specimen. Next, please. So things to consider again is that you have time. A lot of these mushrooms, like except for like the ink cap and all those that Alisa was alluding, that they can basically melt. And they watery mushrooms, they will only last not too long. But some of the mushrooms actually will they be there for months, like the Ganodermas, or years. So there you can come back to them. There's no reason sometimes to even collect them if you stick with the same place and you go back to the area over and over again. So you have some time. The other thing is to have a goal. You have to have a goal when you are collecting things. So try to, again, stick with a plan. It's good to know what you're going for and where are you going to be. Are you going to be working with mushrooms that will actually have to be handled quickly, because if not, they will deteriorate? Or you have mushrooms that you can actually utilize, look at them for more time. In this case, we have here they call them the ear of the wood. That's my name for this. Then the one in the middle will be the lion's mane, and then Lactarius indigo, which is the Lactarius milky, or milky Lactarius, indigo milky, sorry, which they're all here in Florida, and they are different. So some of them will basically, the Lactarius indigos that one will bleed. When it bleeds, change coloration, has this liquid, doesn't decompose fast, but some of them last longer than others. So that's what I'm trying to go to. All right, next, please. It's good to have a data collection sheet. We developed one for journal. It's a little bit, it has some of this stuff that is in here. It has more stuff to it, but it's good to take notes, and it's good to start understanding these different features of the mushroom, so you can actually take those notes and become more familiar with them over time. So one of the things that I consider, obviously, and Alisa alluded to this, is that we have to look at the medium where these mushrooms are growing. A lot of times you will have known, or will help you identify a mushroom just by knowing, it's growing an oak tree, for example. In this case, it's oyster mushrooms. It likes oak trees, so then it's more likely to be. So this kind of stuff will help you along the way as well. If it's in deadwood, right, or in a living tree, because it tells you different things about the mushroom. It's on the ground. One thing is also look is, if you see a mushroom growing on the ground, is it really growing on the ground, or if there's a branch buried on the ground, it's growing in the wood? So things like that will help you, right? Take some time. I sit there, and if you have somebody, in this case, I did have my best partner right here. I consult, you consult, take notes, and talked about it. That's a good way and good habit to question yourself and be better at it. The position, Alicia talked about this, or the cluster is by himself, but the position too, where in the tree is it located? It's in the upper part of the tree, is it at the bottom? Because some lookalikes will prefer certain section of the tree. So that's good to know. It's similar species on their same genus will prefer different parts of the tree. So that's also important to know. Next, please. The cap, shape of the cap, that's very important. I have a cheat sheet that I carry with me. We included one in the journal too as well. So it's kind of like this cartoonish, right? Cartoons help you to identify how the gills are attached. That's a very good indicator of the type of mushroom you're going to be dealing with. The morphology, the type, the shape of the cap as well. And it's important, like I was telling in the beginning, well, a few slides back, knowing a little bit the life cycle of that mushroom, or the whole fungi itself, but also of the mushroom, because the cap might look this way and then kind of concave or convex in a few days. So it might change the shape a little bit, showing that the different, how the mushroom look like as it's developing, that's or maturing. That's a good way also to help you with identification. A smell too, some chanterelles have a particular smell, some of them very unique actually. So knowing the smells for the fungi will help you as well. Taste. I wouldn't recommend you to taste in the apricot. Yes, that's in comments, right? Chanterelle smells like apricot. The taste even can tell you about a lot about the identification. I wouldn't unless you kind of know. I do taste a little bit of it and spit it out. The ones that I know it won't kill me, but I do want to know what it is. But I won't recommend doing that. But yes, another way. If it bleeds, it might mean if it change coloration, I will show you pictures. When you cut it or manipulate the mushroom, it might change colors. And the same thing for bruising, right? Bleeding more likely will produce liquid, so like milky, but also bleeding, it means change colorations. If it kills, obviously, or it has tubes like a bolete, that will help you as well. And the type of attachment, like I was telling you, some oyster mushrooms, right? They don't have the stalk, they don't have, so you can tell kind of what it is just based on how it's attached to the medium. So now I'm going to go into a few examples. Alicia already talked about some of the orders and the difference between them. I'm just going to go over some of the species that we have here in Florida that I found out. By the way, this picture of me with this Jan bolete, that's not here. That's actually, that's the only picture I think that's in Colorado and Tellurites area. But they do find them here. We do have the king boletes here in Florida as well. But boletes are kind of easy to identify. Most boletes have this tubular hymia. So this, the way they release the spores is through this kind of tubing-like structure. So when you turn around a mushroom and you see that, that's definitely a bolete. And there's a lot of them, right? And there's some edibles and some not edibles and growing in very different conditions. So, but that's a really good way to at least knowing that you have a bolete. Again, there's some boletes that have healed looking like not this type, but most of them are like this. Next, please. It's good way, like I was telling you, a knife is good to cut them away from the medium where they're growing, but also to cut them in half. I love to cut them in half just to see how the gills are attached or how the tubes are attached. How does it look like, right? And also, it will, and if it bleeds or change bruises, it will change coloration right there. So it's also, you can actually see, and also to identify if it's hollow or it's not hollow, the stalk. That will also help you identify depending on the species. In this case, you can see very clearly how this bolete is the type of attachment is the adenate, right? The shape it actually really matches this picture right here. So it's very cool to see in that way. If you don't do that cutting, that transactional cut, you wouldn't see that image as clearly as you can see now. Next, please. This is another type of bolete that we found here. This is an edible, by the way. This is the old man of the wood. This is a mushroom that is semi-easy to identify once you've been practicing, obviously. It has the cap, it has all these woolly scales. I don't know if that's why they call them the old man of the wood. Don't know. I'm guessing. Kind of like old skin. But one of the good things about this mushroom is that it bruises really red bright, like you can see, or orange kind of color, depending on what you call red and what you call orange. To me, it's like a tannin orange red color. But as soon as you cut it in half, that's start bruising this color. So not only the scales, not only the dark coloration at the bottom and the tubular pattern, but also the scales, right? The white scale cap, and then the bruising. Yeah, then it is most likely at all men of the woods. Next, please. The Russulas, or in the family Russulaceae, there are many. There are a lot of species in this family, but some of them are very easy to identify, or at least easier to identify than others, right? There's many, but you can tell like here, like for example, this indigo milky, which is a semi-common, I would say, mushroom in the southeast, most likely in other parts of Florida as well. It is very bright red. Bright red. It's not bright red. It's bright blue. There's another Russulas that are bright red. That's why I got confused. And this one actually, like if you cut it in half, you can see how the gills are attached, right? You start kind of bruising that indigo color, very blue. That's one of the few, I'd say bright blue, maybe the only one in this kind of coloration mushroom that's there. So these are kind of easy to identify, right? But going to the same place, like I said, and this seasonality will help you zone in and listen to what species might be, because they have some seasonality to them as well. So that's another thing to take into account. Yeah, that's another Russulas, right? Yeah, this is a very easy to identify. Some of the Russulas are very bright. They have very bright colors, like this purple right here. These reds right here. A lot of them are not edible, at least for us, but you might see a lot of Russulas on the field, in the outdoors, with some bites to it. So some animals do develop some immunity by eating little by little, some of it, and they might be tolerant to a certain amount. So it's not uncommon to see a Russula perfectly standing on the ground with a couple of chews on it from some kind of rodent. I will guess some kind of squirrel. They do love their Russulas. The squirrels do. Some of them, this species, especially right here, they don't exclude milk like the indigo milky. So that's another good way to look at the Lactarius, the genus Lactarius versus the genus Russula, because the Lactarius, all of them, when you cut them, will produce this kind of like milky, this liquid that will come out of their gills and their stem kind of looking like. All right, next, please. Yeah, I think you want one ahead. I don't know. Maybe that's the one. So this is the order Aphyllophorales. This is the Amanitas. Not all of them are bright colors, but a lot of them are. So the destroying angel, the Amanita, which is one of the most poisonous mushrooms that we have, and we do have it here in Florida, is white. But all the Amanitas have something very cool, that they actually develop the mushroom inside this veil, kind of, well, it's called the universal veil here, right? And when it develops, like you can see in this picture right here of this Amanita, is that when it's little, right, it still has some reminiscence of that, and then that's what you see here, which is it comes out of the vulva stay here, right here, right, and the partial veil stays attached. So you can see that from the Amanitas. And the Amanitas, a lot of times you will see multiple mushrooms around in the different stages of development. So it's kind of cool, like in this picture right here, and I do have pictures like that as well. Then you can compare them to, and that's one, again, coming back to some area, looking at trying to see the mushroom, because a mushroom grows there, and one time it will probably grow in there same next season. Sometimes you skip the season or two, sometimes it will grow there more once a year, and that will help you understand what the mushrooms you have around. The chanterelles, obviously, they're very known from a lot of people because they are extremely delicious. They are easier to I keep saying easier to identify. Maybe nothing is easy to identify unless you really practice, but they are very distinctive. That's what I should say. And the way they don't have the gills, right? They have these structures, the gill-like ridges that you can see and display. They're very sturdy, so they don't grow in wood, so they don't grow in cluster. You might see a bunch of them so close to each other, they might look like they're in cluster, but they're not. And that's when you hit the gold pot, right? For those that are actually go and hunt for mushrooms. But the jack-o'-lantern, which is lookalike, which I have a slide coming up, they grow in wood and they grow all together kind of thing. So just looking at the gill-rich structure and the texture, and again, the smell, especially these ones, will help you identify the chanterelles. In this case, I'm comparing here the jack-o'-lantern, which is not necessarily kill you, but it makes you really sick. And yes, it can kill you, especially, it changes by individual and obviously the amount that you ingest if you not help on time as well, if you don't get help by the medical team on time. They're not that difficult to identify. Again, don't eat them, but study them. You have the chanterelles right here in the left, at least to my left. We have these ridges. The jack-o'-lantern had these gills looking like, so it's a little different, right? So, and they grow in clusters. So this is a good way to identify. Next, please. This is an order, the Aphyllophorales. Now it's the agaricales. So in some books, you might see them still has the Aphyllophorales. In some books, they call them the agaricales, but these are the oyster mushrooms. There are some that they are good to eat. Some of them are not. They have very, very interesting. I'm not going to go into it because of time, but maybe later. They have very unique ways to how they eat themselves. But they are attached, as you can see here, how they grow, right? This kind of plate looking like sticking out of the tree. Some of them will be covering in insects. Some of them attract insects, and because they smell differently, and some of them won't. And that's another good way to tell some species of them, right? How they start to decaying And again, where do they grow? Some of them prefer certain types of trees. So knowing the tree will help you identify what kind of oyster you have. Other Aphyllophorales, in same order, we have two families here that they are, again, representative of some of the fungi we have here in Florida, some of the mushrooms that we have in Florida. We have the lion's mane. This one, especially the one on the left, the white one is now being produced at, like Alyssa was saying, you can actually grow it. From a grower, they will give you a block and you can grow in lion's mane. It might look a little different than it might grow in the field, but it is a very good edible mushrooms, very safe and used for many different purposes. And we're going to cover that later. But it's kind of easy to identify, although it will decay kind of quickly. So if you don't find it in the right stage or the right time, you might not look it won't look like that. The other one is the chicken of the woods. That's another good, easy to identify. There's multiple species that share the same common name, so be careful. Good way to annotate where do they grow and what kind of tree and where in the tree are located, what part of the tree. That will help you a lot to identify it as well. This one can last a little longer, so you can come back and see how they grow. Like if you see here in this picture left, right? This is the same picture, but just later it's coming back and see how much is the developed. So that's a cool thing to help you also identify and look at coloration, look at the formation of these clusters, right? Of these shelves looking like structures. So that's another good thing to consider. Next, please. You have